Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to the live stream for today. Things are beautiful here in Los Angeles. It is a beautiful sunny day. The high is only 78. It was like 100 last week. It's going to be in the 90s next week, but this week we get a really beautiful week with blue sky and puffy white clouds. So I hope you're also having wonderful weather wherever you are. And if you are a fall person, that you are enjoying some fall weather. But anyway, thank you for joining me today. And we're going to talk about semantic HTML today, or what we call POSH, which is plain old semantic HTML. So just boring, ordinary HTML. Um, this is an important topic to talk about because it is one of the most common accessibility issues that we see on sites when we're doing audits. That people add a div with an on-click event on it rather than using a button, or forget to wrap their headers in header tags. So just really common issues that happen. And HTML is the foundation upon which a website or a web page is built. And if you don't have that foundation in order, if you don't have that semantic HTML correct from the beginning, it is really difficult or impossible to try to make it accessible after the fact, to try to come back through and make that accessible when you didn't get the foundation right. It's the same as trying to build a house when the foundation isn't right. You can, add all the fancy granite countertops and, uh, you know, wainscoting and crown molding that you want, but at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to fix the fact that there's a problem with the foundation under the house. And that's the same way that it is with HTML. So it doesn't matter if you're hand coding an HTML page like it's 1996. It doesn't matter if you're building a React app or a Vue app or using, any of the other modern JavaScript frameworks, or if you're building a Laravel app or building on any stack. It really doesn't matter. At the end of the day, what gets sent to your users in their browser is HTML, and it is important that you take the time to think through what that HTML should look like and ensure that the tags that you are using are semantic. And I do feel like this gets skipped over a bit sometimes in developer boot camps and developer education. We don't really talk about why it's important to actually use the correct tags. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to dig into this course that I have developed called POSH Foundations. If you want to follow along, all of the information that I'm going to be sharing is available at poshfoundations.tech. So .tech. Just Posh Foundations, no hyphens or anything like that. Poshfoundations.tech. And let me give you a quick tour of how the information works here. So it will automatically detect whether or not you prefer light or dark mode. So that's the auto mode here, but you could also switch it if you decide you would rather have light mode or dark mode. So, when I was very first developing this course, I was giving a lot of thought to how can I make sure that this information is accessible? And, should I use Keynote slides? Should I use Google Slides? Should I use PowerPoint? Should I use something else? And the conclusion I came to at the end of the day is the most accessible thing is just going to be a properly marked up set of HTML pages. So here we are. And then the next thing I had to think about is what's more accessible, light mode or dark mode? And then what accent color is the most accessible? And I decided that just depends on the person. And maybe it even just depends on the person and the day and what's happening. So whatever's going on for you, hopefully you can find a setting here that'll work for you. So you could go with the light or the dark mode. And then you can also choose your accent color. So if you're feeling a little monochromatic, you might go with the zinc color scheme. If you're feeling kind of fall, maybe you want to go with orange. Like bright colors, maybe you want to pick fuchsia, but you can choose whatever you like. And you can change it at any time. This menu is available on every single page. of the site. I'm going to start off in cyan, just feeling like in a cyan mood for today. So that'll be my starting color for the day, and maybe I'll change it throughout the presentation. So this is our the main page that you land on, which just gives you links out to all of the different units. So I'm thinking in the hour-long stream that we're doing this afternoon, we can probably get through units 1 and 2. And then in future live streams, I can go over the other units as well. When we get into a unit, I do have it kind of set up to act like slides. So at that point, you might want to hide the slide menu. So that's an option over here. We can just hide that menu. And then you'll see once we get into the unit that I have the slides kind of programmed so that they fill the screen. And then I have next and previous buttons and back to top buttons to help you kind of move through the presentation. So if you want to jump in there and follow along, because there is some sample code and there's links out to some exercises and things like that, again, it's poshfoundations.tech is where you can follow along if you want to follow along on the content that I'm presenting. I am going to go ahead and skip the introduction because it's just the introduction to who I am and what I do, and I feel like everybody knows that here. So we'll skip that one. If you want to look at it, go ahead. We'll go right ahead and get started with Unit 1, which is talking about why HTML still matters and also giving us a little bit of history on HTML. I do think it is helpful to understand the history behind what we're doing when it comes to code. Plus, a lot of coding things have absolutely fascinating history behind them. So we're going to talk about a little bit today about where HTML came from and what the history of it is, like what were the other languages that came first. So let's dive into this here. All right, so HTML, what that stands for is Hypertext Markup Language. And we do have to get a little bit creative because hypertext is one word. So there's not actually a separate word there for the T, but that's okay. So we abbreviate hypertext as HT, and that just means that there are links in the document that take us to other places. So by 2025, we kind of take web links for granted. You don't really think much about it when you open up a Wikipedia page or an Amazon page or whatever you happen to be looking at. And there's a link there that takes you somewhere else. Like you don't really think about that much today, but historically speaking, the ability to actually link two documents together was a revolution. Because previously you would, if you think about like a textbook, right, that has citations in it, that's how it worked before. Like I would just have to write down, oh, I got this information from this book written by this person. And then you'd have to, go to the library and find that book if you wanted to get that information. But the ability to just automatically link me straight off to whatever my source material was, or if you want to learn more, here's where you can go, and you could go directly there, was completely mind-blowing, like was a complete change in how documents and information were presented. So we do take that for granted now, but when we can really think about that historically, that was a huge change in how information was accessible to people. Then we have the M for markup, and we're going to dig into exactly what does markup mean in just a minute here. And then L is language, which a language is just a system of communication. And of course, there are computer languages like HTML, Python, JavaScript, but of course there's all kinds of other languages as well, human languages, English, French, Spanish, German. There's sign language, right? Different types of sign language, British Sign Language, American Sign Language. There's many different ways that we create language. All right, so let's dig into that markup because we left that as a little bit of a mystery there, rather. Not a history, but a mystery. So a markup is just a way that we're going to take some content, some text content most likely, and we're going to define some kind of structure or presentation or meaning in that document. And that does originate from the publishing industry. So of course, the internet and computers have only really been around for, less than 100 years total. But publishing goes back a lot further, and publishing had some needs that they needed to address before computers were around. And the way that they did that was with markup in a language called typesetting marks. So this is a sample of a news article. It's actually kind of charming. Don't worry if you can't read this this image of it. I wasn't able to get a super high resolution image of this newspaper article. The text of the article does appear on the next slide. So if you can't make it out because it's all kind of squiggly and doesn't look super great, don't worry about it. The content is available on the next slide. So this is an article from the 1930s when car ownership was still a pretty novel thing, and it outlines a nice little car trip that you could take through New England here in the United States on a Sunday afternoon, perhaps. And it does seem to be part of a regular series, so that might be a fun thing to kind of look up. So we have the Clara Barton birthplace in Oxford, and we have a photo of it. And then we have a nice big headline, right? Auto tour to Oxford includes visit to the home of Clara Barton. And then I know that we can't really see the article that well, but we can pick out that we have maybe another heading here. Introducing this section. And then even in this section here, that's quite blurry that we can't quite read, we can still kind of pick out that here in the middle looks like another kind of little heading. We have a heading over here, right? Some bigger text. And then here's another little tiny heading. Another big section of the article here. We have a very lovely 1930s ad. Rent a portable typewriter for $1 a week. So that's very charming. So this article does continue beyond this first page there. I think there was 2 or 3 pages total. I don't have them all here, but I do have the text of this article. So this was before computers were really around to help out publishers. And so the author who wrote this, or the journalist who wrote this article, right, would have typed this up on one of those portable typewriters for $1 a week. And it would have looked a lot like this, right? It would have just been plain text. And there's not really a way on a typewriter, like if you haven't ever used one, if you're not familiar, they don't really have different fonts or different font sizes, right? They type one thing. And that's all there is. If it's a fancy typewriter, maybe it will do like italics, but it's not going to do big header text, right? It's not going to be able to do that and create different levels of headlines and, smaller text for captions under photos. Like it's just not going to be able to do those kinds of things. And so what that author would have turned over would have been just a typewritten document to the editor of the newspaper, and the editor of the newspaper then would have gone through with a pen or a pencil and would have written typesetter's marks in the margins on the paper to instruct the typesetter of the article who was sending the paper off to print. Hey, here's my big heading. I want this in really big type across the top of the page. And here's my level 2 heading, right? So make that a level 2 heading. So there would have been a standard at each publication, right? At each newspaper, each magazine would have had a standard for what like a level 2 heading looked like. So they would have said, hey, make that a level 2 heading. This one was also a level 2 heading. And then we have Beautiful Road here. That would be like a level 3 heading. Old Tavern, that's like a level 3 heading. Hartford, another one. Right. And then this is what makes me think it's part of a series, is that it does end with this another trip next Sunday. And this is about 50 miles total. So quite a little Sunday drive. But anyway, looks like it might have been a lot of fun. So those kind of typesetter marks is what eventually gave rise to a computerized version of doing that. So by 1969, we had a generalized markup language that was created by IBM. And then over time, that became a standard generalized markup language, which then eventually became HTML. And we have HTML is not the only markup language that's still in use. So you may be familiar with Markdown, which is kind of funny name when you think about it, for a markup language being called Markdown. But that's another way of marking up text, right? Where you can wrap square brackets around links, and you can use, I think it's usually equal signs, right, to mark out your different levels of headings, and the little hyphens that make bullet points and things like that. So like that's just another flavor of markup. So HTML isn't the only one that we have in common use these days. There's lots of different ways of marking up content. So let's take a look at this generalized markup language. So this is our first computerized markup language. And when you first look at it, you might recognize a few things going on there. So first we see that the actual markup, right, or the typesetter's marks are set off from the rest of the text because they begin with a colon and end with a period. So here I have a colon on the left side, and then they end with a period, and then I have my line of text. So I can see right away that I have an H1. I can even apply an ID to it. So that's an interesting concept. And my chapter 1 heading, I have a paragraph. I have an ordered list with different list items. And then I have a nice little tag for the end of the ordered list. So EOL. And here's my paragraph. So what's interesting about GML is that we have colons and periods for setting off our instructions from the rest of our text. We also, it is per line. So with the exception of the ordered list, you notice that nothing else actually has a closing tag, right? There's nothing to kind of tell me, here's the end of my heading, here's the end of my paragraph. It's just known that it's this line. So this could be a little bit unwieldy if I have a long paragraph, right? Because my whole paragraph has to be on one line to be considered a paragraph in this markup language. So we can see how it's helpful. It's definitely a step in the right direction, but it is somewhat limited and it might not work very well for long or complex documents. So let's take a look at the standard generalized markup language, which is what came along next. And this might start to look a little bit more familiar if you're familiar with what HTML looks like. So now we can see that we are setting off our instructions from the rest of our text with angle brackets. Right? So we have a left-facing angle bracket at the beginning and a right-facing angle bracket at the end, which tells the computer that's the end of the tag. And we also see the use of the slash in front of a tag to mark it as the closing tag. This is the end of the title. And here we have lines and we have the end of the line. So if I wanted to mark up a paragraph in this language, I could actually have that paragraph take up multiple lines of text and be a lot more readable and a lot less unwieldy. And I would just be able to put an end of paragraph tag to mark that I'm at the very, very end. So we can kind of see how things are evolving here. And of course, that leads us over to HTML that we know of today, where I can mark up that this is an article, that this is my recipe for chocolate chip cookies. I'm going to use the H1 for that because it is the main idea or the main heading of the page or of this article. Paragraph, I have a subheading, right? Ingredients that come under my H1, an unordered list of all of my ingredients, and then an ordered list of my instructions, right? So the unordered list, because it doesn't really matter what order these ingredients are in. I need all of those ingredients, whether I list the butter or the sugar first, it doesn't matter. I need them both. And for the instructions, an ordered list, because I do have to do things in the right order, right? I can't bake them first and then preheat the oven and then cream the ingredients together. That's just not going to work. So I do have to follow this in order. So we're going to use an ordered list. So we start to see more and more semantics introduced into the markup, and it starts to look more and more familiar to us kind of as we go along. Now, if I wanted to use Markdown instead, this is what that might look like. So for my heading level 1 with a pound sign or a number sign or a hash mark, whatever you like to call that. I think another word for it is an octothorpe. So whatever you like to use, one of those to mark off a H1, two of those to mark off an H2. Nothing around a paragraph, nothing needed for that. Dashes to create an unordered list, and then we go ahead and use the numbers to create an ordered list. And if we use, a markdown to HTML converter, that would convert this markdown here to this same markup that we see in HTML, except for the article tag. That wouldn't get added in this particular case. Right? So my main message here is HTML isn't dead, right? It's got a long history. It's got a lot of ancestors that have been really helpful as things have gone along. And it is still the foundation of everything that we do on the web. Even when we're being super fancy and building single page apps in React, we're still at the end of the day creating HTML, and it matters what tags we're using while we're doing that. Everything at the end of the day is rendering HTML to the DOM, right? Flash is dead. Nobody's using Flash anymore. Everything becomes HTML at the end of the day. And it does matter which tags you might use for doing that. So I've used the word semantic a few times, but we haven't really talked about what that means. What do I mean when I say we need to use the semantic tag? So semantic tags describe what something is, not what it looks like. So if I were to be marking up a magazine article that I wanted to display on the web, and I had, a pull quote, an impactful pull quote that the person the article is about had said, and I wanted to pull it out, put it in big text, I wouldn't want to mark that up as a heading because it's not a heading. It's just some impactful text, right? It's just another paragraph in the article, essentially. And so behind the scenes in the HTML, I would just want to have that marked up as a paragraph tag. And I would use then CSS to apply some styles to it to make the text large, maybe bold, maybe a different color, maybe it has a background color, borders, all different kinds of things that it could have. But it is semantically just a paragraph. It is actually a quote, and there are quote tags that we could wrap around it. So that's valid. But we wouldn't want to mark it up as a heading, right? The purpose of a heading tag is to actually say, this bit of text here, it is a heading. It does mark up, it does tell me either what this whole page and what this whole article is about, or what this section or subsection of this page or article is about. That is the function of a heading. And so we don't want to just throw around heading tags anytime we need big text, because headings actually have a job to do, and we want to be respectful of that job. So when something is acting as a heading, it's telling me what's the next bit of content that comes after this. That's when we're going to use a heading tag, no matter what it happens to look like. So we want to make sure that those tags are defining the purpose of the content that's inside. That is helpful to search engines if you're concerned about search engine optimization. It's helpful to AI if you're trying to encourage AI models to come and scrape your content and hopefully send you some traffic for your business. It is additionally also helpful for assistive technology that is trying to consume your content and then give it to a person with disabilities who is using that assistive technology to access your page. So that's why it's so important. It helps to make our content machine understandable, machine readable, so that a computer can understand it and understand how it is structured, how the different bits of content relate to one another, and help people then to understand that content, because the machine understands it. And so the machine can say, hey, here's an article about chocolate chip cookies. Here's the headings that are in the article, right? We're going to get the story about the lady who invented the chocolate chip cookies. We're going to get a little bit of the history of chocolate. We're going to learn about butter, right? And then we're going to learn about the cookies. So if the assistive technology can understand that those are the sections of the article, it can then communicate that to the person who's reading the article, that here's what's here. And then if they're doing research or they're just interested in chocolate chip cookies, they can understand, is this an article I want to read? Is this going to be helpful or interesting to me or not? So we can use that HTML to create the outline of the document. So by having our H1 at the top, H2s for each heading up each section of content, H3s for each subsection under those sections, and so on all the way down to H6. Those headings can then be pulled out of the document and can act as the outline or the overall structure. It also helps us to understand the relationship between the different bits of content. So if I have an image on the page and then I just put a paragraph after it that contains the caption of the image, well, there's nothing programmatically tying those two things together, right? There's nothing that programmatically says that paragraph is providing a caption for that image. So I would want to use different tags than that, right? I would want to use a figure tag with a fig caption tag, because that's going to programmatically say this bit of text, it goes with this image. These two things go together. And the same thing, like if I'm listing out the ingredients for those chocolate chip cookies, I could just do that in a series of paragraph tags, right? A paragraph around the sugar, the butter, etc. But again, like that doesn't communicate that that's a list of things that go together. By marking that up as an unordered list, I'm alerting a computer, but then also a person, that here's a list of things that all go together. And it makes our content easier to understand and ingest. So what kind of things go wrong when we don't use semantic HTML? So this is probably, I would say, the most common semantic HTML fail that I come across doing audits and things like that. Accessibility testing is a div with an on-click handler that says click me. So here's what that might look like, right? It looks fine, but we have some problems, right? So first of all, I can't reach that with a keyboard. So if I'm a user who can't use a mouse and I rely on a keyboard or some kind of assistive technology that acts like a keyboard, whether that could be a sip and puff device, it could be some kind of a switch device, it could be anything that really attaches to any part of my body that I can control the movement of. I'm not going to be able to get to that button. I'm not going to be able to move focus there. It's not going to announce itself as a button to somebody who's using a screen reader. The screen reader isn't going to understand that that's supposed to be a button. And maybe more importantly, it's not going to trigger a form submission, right? It's not going to work like a button unless I have to write that all out in this JavaScript. And that's a lot of extra work that I'm doing for not really any purpose. Like I could just use the correct tag and I would get all of that functionality for free. So I've already talked about this a little bit, but right, like the purpose of a heading tag isn't just to make big, bold text. The purpose of a heading tag is to say, this is a heading for the content that comes after this. This tells me what the next bit of content that's here is all about. That's the purpose of a heading. It doesn't matter what it looks like. It could even just look like a paragraph, right? It could look just like the text around it, but maybe it acts as a heading for the content that comes after. And that's what the purpose of a heading tag is. So let's talk about some common misconceptions that I hear. Oh, it's no problem. You can just fix it with ARIA and JavaScript. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And even when you can, it's significantly more work. And even if you do everything correctly, which that's pretty rare, because I think we a lot of times take for granted all of the functionality that comes with something like a button or a link, and we forget about it, right? We forget that, like, oh yeah, it's not just that you click a link and it takes you somewhere. You can also right click on it and say to save it or open it in a new tab or a new window. Like there's all this other functionality that comes along with a link that we forget about. And then when we try to emulate it, with just a div tag and some ARIA and some JavaScript, we forget about it. So even when you don't forget about it and you do it perfectly and you recapture all of that built-in functionality that a link or a button has, it's not going to work as reliably across all different assistive technologies and all different devices as if you had just used the semantic tag. So please know that. The ARIA labels, ARIA tags, and things like that, they are just not as reliable across all different devices as just the semantic HTML. Don't think that accessibility is just handled by your component library. So if you're building a React app or a Vue app or an Ember app or whatever you happen to be working in, like, don't just assume that like, oh, we got this library, we're just using we're just using Tailwind, or we're just using Google Material, and it handles all of that. It probably doesn't. It probably doesn't. Even if it has been advertised that it does, it probably doesn't. So please know that. And that is still something that you need to think about. And especially when you need to build a custom component, it's not going to handle all of that for you. And then to think that like, well, I don't really write HTML because I write JSX. Well, that's true. That's true. If you're writing a React app, you are writing JSX, but that gets rendered as HTML, and you need to give some thought to what instructions you're handing to JSX so that you have an idea and an awareness of what the code is that it's putting out at the other end. That's also some knowledge that you need to have to evaluate the different component libraries that are available. Like, what kind of code are they putting out? Are they just writing divs for everything, and they don't have ARIA attributes and they don't have semantic HTML tags? Like, that's probably not a component library that you want to use in that case. So you have to be aware of all of those things, because no matter what you're doing, whether you're in, you're in Laravel, or you're in some backend language, or you're in React, or you're in Vue, like at the end of the day, you are creating HTML that's getting sent to the browser, and you need to know what that HTML is, and you need to know how to control it and have it be what you want, because that is your foundation, right? Like your first line of defense for ensuring that what you're building is actually accessible. Divs and spans are not bad. They're not evil. I don't want you to feel like, oh, I can never use them. Understand what they're for and how to use them correctly. So they are there as a way to provide containers for you when you need a container, but you don't necessarily want that container to impart some kind of semantic meaning to a bit of code, right? So maybe I've got an article tag wrapped around, a blog post on my site, but I want to do something kind of fancy with it, and I need to put an extra div around it. Like, that's what they're for. That's what they're for. I don't want another semantic container to confuse things, but I do need to have another container just for CSS styling purposes, to, add a fancy layered background, or, some other kind of thing that whatever I might be doing. Like, that's where divs and spans come in, is when you need a container wrapped around a bit of content, but it's not for semantic reasons. It's just for design reasons. All right, so here are the exercises that are at the end of Unit 1. So let's take a quick look at these. So they are some samples designs that I pulled off of Figma. So there's free designs from the Figma community that you can use for different purposes. And let's give some thought, because these are some pretty common design patterns that you would see across websites, across the internet. And let's just take a moment to pause and think about how we might mark these up. I think that generally developers are kind of out of the habit of doing that, of just taking a moment to look at a design and just to give some thought to semantically, what is this content, and what tags would be the best tags for marking up this content, and what would make the most sense here. So of course, these components are out of context, so we don't actually know exactly what heading level would be appropriate. But I think if we just assume that these are sections of content on a page, and And I do have links here if you want to challenge yourself to go and do these. I do have links here that will take you to code pens with this setup. So I have this bit of code here marked up with all non-semantic tags. And to do the exercise, you would just go ahead and edit this code pen and put in whatever tags that you think might be the correct semantic ones. And I do have my solution is also linked here. So if you want to come over here, work through this exercise and mark up this code in whatever way you think is appropriate semantically, and then you could come back and see what my solution is. Now, I don't want you to think that my solution is the only correct one. You might have done something differently and it might be perfectly fine. So that is a possibility. So don't feel like just because you look at your code and it's slightly different from mine that it's wrong. That's not necessarily the case. There's definitely more than one way to mark up the same content and have it be semantic. Both ways. It's just going to depend from person to person, from situation to situation, which one you might prefer. And it might differ from person to person in certain ways. Now, this is pretty simple and straightforward. So hopefully there wouldn't be too much variation in our code, but there could be some. So that would be the first exercise that you can do. And if you're just joining the website where all of the material that I'm going over today is poshfoundations.tech. And you can follow along and do the exercises at your own leisure. All right, so we have a question for which language is easy to start a web development. So that's really going to depend on your own experience. If you have experience with any kind of back-end languages, whichever one that you have experience with can probably be used to generate a website. If you are a front-end developer just getting started, you definitely would want to focus on learning HTML first and getting a good handle on HTML, and then CSS and JavaScript for how to build out the front end of a website. And HTML is helpful for all developers to know. So the semantic stuff that we're going over today is helpful for you, whether you're a backend developer or a front-end developer, because even backend developers often send some HTML to the front end. So you should know which tags you should be using to do that. All right. So our second exercise here, we have an image, we have a heading, so that's a hint, a heading tag of some kind, some text here, and then we have what looks like a button. But is it actually a button? So that's something to think about. Let's talk about that for a second. Let's talk about the difference between links and buttons. So a link is going to take you somewhere. It's going to take you to another page, another area on the same page. If it's a single page app, right, it's going to take you to another component or another view. That's a link. A button is going to do anything else. So submit a form, open a modal, trigger a drop down to open or close a tooltip. All of those things would all be buttons. Okay, so if it takes you somewhere else, it's a link. If it doesn't, and it just does something else, it's a button. We have a lot of common design patterns in web development today that look like buttons, like this, but when you think about what they do, when you click on them, are they a link or are they a button? All right, so you can go ahead and do those couple of exercises. And you can come back here and post a comment to your code pen with the results, and I can take a look and give you some feedback on how well you did. So to wrap up Unit 1, HTML is not optional to learn. It is critical to understand how to use semantic HTML tags. And it does not matter what you are using to do web development with. If it's React, if it's Vue, if it's PHP, if it's Laravel, if it's Python, if it's just it does not matter. You still need to know semantic HTML. You need to know HTML at the end of the day because that is what is getting sent to your users' browsers. If you've ever thought HTML, that's just easy peasy, it doesn't really matter, you have to think again because HTML is actually super important. All right, so that's the end of Unit 1. Let's go ahead and jump over to Unit 2, where we're going to talk about landmarks and structure. And I feel like it's time to switch our color scheme. Let's go with pink. Let's go with pink. All right, so let's get started digging in. So you can just leave comments on either the YouTube video or on the LinkedIn event if you have some code pen that you want me to take a look at. So leave it in either of those places. It'll get to me and I will come and take a look and respond to your comment and give you some feedback on how you did on those exercises. All right, so Unit 2 is all about landmarks. So pages need structure, right? We can't just have a whole bunch of divs sitting around on a page. We need to have some kind of structure there. That's going to help search engines. It's going to help AI who's coming along and scanning your page. And of course, it is going to help, most importantly, assistive technology and users who are coming along to your page to use it. So we want to make sure that when we're setting up our HTML, that we're setting up a hierarchy and defining what all the different areas of content are. And how we are going to do that is by using a series of landmarks. And landmarks are tags that define sections of our page and group-related content. So let's dig into what those look like. If a user is using assistive technology, they can skip around between the different landmarks if we have properly set them up in our document. People using assistive technology can use those to jump around to the different parts of our content. So if they want to jump directly to the main content and they want to skip over our navigation and our header and our footer, they're able to do that. And then we want to make sure that those different sections have accessible names so that they can understand what those sections are. All right, the first landmark we're going to talk about is our header element, which is equivalent to the banner role. So I have 3 different ways here of marking up a header section. So a header, right, is that repeating content that appears at the top of the page. It typically has the logo of the website and the main navigation, and it may have some other things as well, like sign up for our newsletter, right? It may have some other kind of basic information included in there, but the little chunk of content that appears basically at the top of every single page. So I have 3 different ways of marking that up. Number 1, I can just use a header tag. So we have a semantic HTML element just for marking up headers, which is the header element. And that's what example number 1 here looks like. If for some reason I'm using some kind of platform that doesn't allow me to use a header tag, then I can use the ARIA role of banner. That would also create a header. And what you will really commonly see across the web is the third pattern that I have here, where I have both, where I am using a header tag, but I'm also giving that header a role of banner. And that is redundant, okay, because the header tag is defining this as a header landmark, but then also the role of banner is defining this as a banner or header landmark. However, there's no drawback or downside to having that redundancy there. And that was a really popular way of approaching it a few years ago when not all browsers and not all assistive technology supported both methods. So some of them would support the tag better and some of them would support the role better. So this became a common way of doing it. It's no longer necessary, but it's also not going to hurt anything. So if you want to do it that way, that's perfectly fine. It's not going to cause any problems. But I would say lean toward using the tag in any situation that you can, because the semantic HTML is always the better solution over the ARIA solution. Use the ARIA solution only as a last resort. All right, so that's the repeating content across the top of the page. Let's take a look at our next landmark, which is our nav element or our navigation role. So again, we have 3 different ways of marking it up. We can use a nav element. We could use a role of navigation. This one's a little easier to remember because nav and navigation actually seem alike, unlike header and banner, which don't seem to have much in common at all. And if we want to be redundant, we can do this. Now, the nav landmark is unique among the other landmarks that we're going to talk about. And I think I have a slide on it later. So I'm not going to dig into that super in a lot of detail right now. But I do have a note here that if you have more than one, because most web pages these days actually do have more than one navigation region, right? There may be one going across the top, there may be one down the side, there may be one or more in the footer area, and there may even be ones in between, like a pagination might be in there as well, right? Pagination is navigation, and so it should be marked up in a nav tag as well. And so we might have more than one on the page, and if we do, we just need to make sure that the extras have accessible names. And we'll look at what that looks like. So here's what that looks like. So if I happen to have more than one nav on a page, I want to make sure that they have accessible names so I can tell them apart from one another. Because otherwise, as a screen reader user, right, if a user is a screen reader user and they are blind, don't make the assumption that all screen reader users are blind. Let's say we have someone who is blind and using a screen reader. They are just going to hear there's 4 navigations on the page. What's the difference between them? Why are there 4? Nobody can tell. So that's why we want to make sure that they have accessible names to make clear what their different purposes are. So you can see here, I'm using this ARIA label attribute to say that this is pagination. So if I have, my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. pagination numbers, I would give it an ARIA label of pagination. So my second one, I have a different way of doing it, but also works just fine. I'm using the ARIA labeled by attribute, and I'm referring to an ID that already appears on the page. So this is actually a more preferred method than using the ARIA label, because now I've got this content, table of contents, is visible on the page for everybody. So everybody can quickly understand, what is this list of links? Why is it here? So you benefit from that, whether you're using assistive technology or not, and whether you have a disability or not, you can immediately understand that this collection of links here is a table of contents for the current page. So we just use ARIA labeled by, it gets an ID, and here's our ID, and it's just going to use whatever text happens to be inside that tag is going to be what gets used as the accessible name for that landmark. All right, next landmark is our main, and this one is very nice because the ARIA role and the tag match, so very easy to remember. So a main tag or some other tag with a role of main, or of course the redundant one. And you can only have one per page, only one main per page, the main area of content on the page. And that should be the reason that this page exists, right? So if it's a blog post page, just the content of that blog post is going to be in the main tag. Any, sidebar, header, footer is going to be outside of that. And we're going to be able to jump straight to the main bit of content and read it directly without getting hung up in 100 links that might happen to be in the header navigation. We also have an aside, which gets a role of complementary. So just a warning, main is very nice. The remaining ones don't make any sense. So we have aside and complementary. And this is for, when you have a little sidebar on the side that says, here's our 5 most recent blog posts, or our 5 most popular Instagram posts, or sign up for our newsletter, and things like that. So little bits of content that are kind of tangentially related to the main content, but not really. That's what we would use this for. So we can use either an aside tag, we can use a role of complementary, and of course there's multiple ways to spell complementary, so make sure you get the right spelling, or you can be redundant and use an aside with the role of complementary. All right, next up is footer. which matches with the role of content info. So this is all of the content that repeats across the bottom of the screen, right? It usually has links out to legal pages like your privacy policy, your accessibility statement, things like that. It'll have your copyright information. It might have a little bit of information on the company. It might have like a sitemap or some navigation included in it. So that's really common across the web. And here it's a footer tag, or a role of content info, or a footer with the role of content info. So any of those three ways of marking it up. And here's what it might look like when we have a whole page. So it is important to note a few things. So with the exception of nav, header, main, footer, and aside all need to be at the top level of the document. They cannot be nested inside one another. So I can't put my aside inside the main region. I can't put, a footer inside main. They all have to be top level in the document, and they can't be nested inside one another. Nav is the only exception to that. Nav can sit out on its own, like I have it here, or it can be nested in any of the other items. So nav can go anywhere on the page, and nav is the one that you most commonly would have more than one of. And like I said, if you have more than one, make sure that they have accessible names so that at a glance or at a quick listen with a screen reader, somebody can tell like, oh, it's the main nav, the pagination, and some legal pages, right? Like a legal nav, are what are on this page, and they can quickly understand that. Okay, we additionally have a couple of tags for section and article. So section is helpful for marking up a section of content that's on a page, right? So like your hero section at the top of a home page, right, like a call to action section that might have a heading and an image and some text and a link, right? So to group that all together and to tell assistive technology, or, an SEO bot or an AI bot, here's a chunk of content that goes together. That's what we would use a section tag for. If you have a complete composition, right? So could be a whole book, but probably it's going to be something like a blog post that you've written, right? A complete composition that's written inside of a document. That's what's going to get an article tag wrapped around it. And just as a quick note, sections and articles can have their own header and footer sections nested inside them, and those become headers and footers for just that section or just that article. Okay. Oh, I had a slide on that already, so I didn't have to describe it. Okay. So yes, so you could take and create a header section that has, like the title of the article or the title of the section, your byline, your date that it was published, any categories or tags that it might be in, things like that. Your footer section could have categories or tags. It could have the link for read more. It could have, a list of your sources for the article. It could have all different kinds of things in it. So sections and articles can have their own internal structure. And so they are a little bit unique in that way. Okay, and then we also have something called a role of region, which is basically an ARIA tag for creating a section, is how that's going to act at the end of the day. You do have to make sure if you use a role of region that it has an accessible name. So using either an ARIA label attribute, or as I have in this example here, the more preferred method of using an ARIA labeled by attribute that's going to refer to some visible text on the page that's acting as a header or a accessible name for that section of content. So hopefully whatever system you're working with will allow you to actually use a section tag. But if for some reason you can't, you do have this role of region that you can use instead. So that is available to you. But again, the ARIA roles do not work as reliably as semantic HTML across all the different browsers and assistive technology and things like that. So you always want to lean toward using the semantic HTML rather than the fallback of ARIA, right? ARIA is just a last resort when you can't do anything else. All right, so we talked about this a little bit already, but our H1 should be the main idea of what our whole document is about, right? Looks like our About Us page would be About Us would be the H1. If I have sections of content, the history of our company, the founders of the company, different sections like that, those will get marked up with an H2. If I have subsections inside of those, like, oh, there's 3 founders of the company, so in the founder section, maybe I have an H3 for each of their names and a little write-up on each of them inside of that. And that's going to build the outline. So if you remember, like in 6th grade, making the document outlines with Roman numerals and things like that, that's what our headings can do for our document. All right, so I have a question here. For those of us who don't write code frequently but want the option to generate it when needed, is there a static.pdf available to identify the necessary references you've provided here? So all of the information that I've provided here is available on a website called poshfoundations.tech. It's not available as a PDF, but it is available as a set of HTML documents. So you should be able to get to it. It is pretty carefully marked up with semantic HTML, so it should be navigable if you're using assistive technology, and should be consumable by any kind of machine that might want to come along and consume it. All right, so when you're using headings, I think one of the most common issues that I see is skipping heading levels. So you have an H1, that's the title of a blog post. And then when you have sections inside the blog post, those should be H2s, but a lot of times people will use an H2, an H3, or an H4. And I think the reason that people make that jump a lot of times is because they think, oh, the H2, it's too big, right? I don't like the style of it, it's too big. But what you should do at that point is adjust your CSS so that the heading 2 looks more the way that you want it to, or have your developer adjust the CSS so that the heading 2 looks the way that you want it to, and it fits in with the design of the rest of the site. You shouldn't resort to using the wrong heading levels or non-semantic tags for headings at that point. You just need to adjust the CSS styles or have a developer do it. All right. Whoops, I think I skipped ahead too much. Where am I? Headings. All right, the humble div. So we talked about this a little bit already, but you do have these non-semantic tags available to you if you need to group content for non-semantic reasons, for just design or layout purposes, and you don't want to give semantic meaning to it. You do have a div available to help you to do that. It is not bad or wrong to use divs. You just want to make sure that you're using them for the correct purposes and that there isn't a better semantic tag to be used. But they are really helpful for creating, more complex layouts, and different design patterns and things like that can only really be done if you add in a few divs or spans wrapped around some content. So don't be afraid to use them. Just be really careful and intentional when you're using them to make sure that that's the most appropriate thing. All right, and then we have a couple of exercises here. And again, if you want to try these exercises and then leave a comment on either LinkedIn or YouTube, I will see it and I can come along and give you some feedback on how you did on the exercise. So these are some more free designs from the Figma community. And for this one, I just want you to give some thought to how you would set up the main regions for this page, right? So not the complete markup of this page, because that's a lot of work, but just to think about looking at this design and looking at the different bits of content that are here. What would you highlight? Which sections of content would you use? Which landmarks would you use? What heading levels would you use? And how would you kind of create the different regions of this design? And I do have down here a link to my solution, but once again, like, my solution is not the only correct one. So if yours looks a little different, that doesn't mean it's wrong. There's definitely more than one way of breaking this design down into regions and headings. So just because yours looks different than mine, which it probably will, like, unless you look at mine first, right? Yours is probably going to look different. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It doesn't mean that at all. So if you want to share it with me, I can definitely take a look at it and give you some feedback on how you did. And that is the end of our Unit 2. So again, we want to make sure that we're breaking down an HTML document into landmarks. We have those top level, heading, header, footer, main, nav, and aside, that all of our content on a page should be in one of those landmarks. Those landmarks, except for nav, should all be at the top level of the document. Nav could be at the top level of the document on its own, or it could be nested inside any of the others. If you have more than one nav on the page, make sure that they have accessible names so that somebody doesn't just hear, there's 5 navs here. They hear, oh, there's a main nav, there's a pagination, there's an article nav, there's a legal nav, etc. And they can understand what those different navigations are. If you want to visit the course materials, it is at poshfoundations.tech. And just leave a comment on the YouTube video or a comment on the LinkedIn event. I will see it and I will answer if you have any additional questions or you want me to take a look at your exercises and give you some feedback on how you did on those. I'm happy to do that if you just leave a comment with how you did. But I think that'll be it for today. We'll go ahead and wrap up. So 2 weeks from today, we'll pick up and dive into units 3 and 4 during a 1-hour session 2 weeks from today. So I hope that you're able to join me for that. Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. I hope that you have a wonderful day, and I will see you in 2 weeks.